It's wild how obsessed we are with our own doom. Let's dive right into this explainer because really, humanity has this relentless, cyclical fascination with the end. And I don't just mean a literal Hollywood-style apocalyptic end of the world. We are completely captivated by the ends of power, the collapse of entire systems, the shifting of our beliefs, and that terrifying loss of stability. So, welcome to our deep dive into The End is Nearish, where we're going to unpack exactly how this core idea of collapse connects our politics, our psychology, our history, and our culture. When you look back at history, every single manufactured panic shares this incredibly predictable, almost comforting rhythm. We're talking about events like the religious fervor of the Millerites back in 1844, or the literal hysteria over poisonous gas from Halley's Comet in 1910. Fast forward a bit, and we had the massive global dread of a digital collapse with Y2K, and then, of course, the whole misread Mayan calendar situation in 2012. Each one of these events shares a clear trigger, right? Then the fear gets amplified by society, it turns into mass belief, and then, well, without fail, the prediction completely fizzled out. And what do? We eventually just repeat the exact same cycle with a brand new trigger. So here's the real kicker. Our dread, it isn't actually about the final curtain at all. It's about the absolutely terrifying lack of control leading up to it. People don't actually fear the end itself. They fear uncertainty. Think about it. We would rather invent a highly specific date and reason for our own destruction than just sit quietly with the uncomfortable truth that life is unpredictable. By putting a concrete timestamp on the apocalypse, we ironically give ourselves this false sense of control over the completely uncontrollable. All right, let's move into Section 1, the politics of power, and exactly why endings are so heavily resisted. Here's a universal truth. Power rarely wants to let go of itself. Think about caretaker governments or so-called lame duck leaders. These are temporary leaders during election periods or ones serving out their final terms. Officially, they're supposed to just maintain stability, avoid major sweeping decisions, and keep things fair. But the reality? Leaders nearing the end of their term lose influence incredibly fast. Why? Because the public's attention instantly shifts to whoever is coming next. You see this with U.S. presidents in their final terms. They really struggle to pass major policies, which often leads to systems being manipulated just to extend or maintain that dying grasp on control. This sets up a really powerful debate clash. You have the systemic desire for steady, predictable endings directly fighting against the democratic need for transition. On one side of the ring, you have the absolute necessity for stability and continuity. A system has to keep functioning without completely collapsing during a handover, right? But on the other side, you have democracy and change, which fundamentally require the old system to end so the new one can actually begin. Endings, by their very nature, create this intense, high-stakes competition long before they even happen. A genuinely outstanding historical example of this is Queen Elizabeth I. She deliberately delayed and absolutely refused to name an heir for the longest time. And the reason is brilliant. She knew that acknowledging a political ending would immediately torpedo her own authority. The split second a successor is known, loyalty immediately shifts toward the future. The current leader's power gets diluted and conspiracies start breeding in the shadows. She fully understood that the best way to manage the end was to just deny it for as long as humanly possible. Moving right along to Section 2, the psychology of collapse, and what we call the last chance effect. We've all experienced this. Perceived deadlines create massive urgency. It's the last chance effect in action. It's exactly why students will frantically study at 2 a.m. the night before an exam, or why we suddenly buy a bunch of stuff we don't really need just because an online flash sale is ending. And hey, governments do it too. They rush major, impactful decisions right before an election. When the end feels close, our urgency absolutely spikes. But there's a twist here. If the end is always supposedly nearish, but never actually arrives, we eventually become completely numb to the risk. We hit a wall of fatigue from that constant low-level panic. And honestly, that psychological numbness, that is exactly why the doomsday clock exists. It's not a scientific instrument. It's a political tool designed to shake us awake. The doomsday clock measures how close humanity is to destruction, with midnight representing global catastrophe. But the crucial takeaway is that the clock's movements aren't a strict mathematical prediction of the future. The time change is based on global risks specifically to influence our behavior. It's meant to jolt us out of our apathy and force serious policy changes before it's literally too late. Which brings us to Section 3, the point of no return. What happens when these endings actually become real? This is where things get heavy. Unlike past false alarms like Y2K, things like climate change forces us to ask a really sobering ethical question about our planetary stability.
What if the damage is already irreversible? It introduces this terrifyingly real concept of finality that human history really hasn't had to reckon with on a global scale before. Because now we are facing actual physical points of no return, forcing humanity to confront a pretty grim new reality. Ecosystems are displaying extreme instability, which historically is the classic precursor to total collapse. Extreme weather is becoming way more frequent. We're seeing coral reefs die off permanently, and ice caps melting well beyond any hope of recovery. These aren't just hypotheticals or future warnings anymore. These are physical systems ending right before our eyes. And it forces us into a very tight corner. Do we keep fighting to stop the inevitable, or do we pivot everything toward adapting to it? And this irreversible damage creates a profound moral dilemma. The end of one system, like melting Arctic ice, actually becomes a massively lucrative opportunity for another. Welcome to the disaster economy. As the ice melts, new and incredibly profitable Arctic shipping routes open up. As extreme weather increases, the disaster insurance industry absolutely booms, right alongside massive billion-dollar investments in climate tech. It sets up this critical clash. Are we seeing brilliant human innovation and survival, or are we just witnessing the greedy exploitation of a dying planet? Because for sure, the end of one thing almost always means the beginning of a brand new market.
Okay, let's wrap this up with Section 4, Cultural Reflections and the Ultimate Debate Frame.
If you want to know what a society is afraid of, just look at its art. The end always acts as a mirror for our current anxieties. Back in Renaissance art, think of sweeping depictions of the Last Judgment. The end of the world was framed entirely around moral judgment and divine endings. Heaven versus hell. It was all about religious fear. But contrast that with modern media today. Our apocalyptic stories are almost entirely about chaos, technological or ecological dystopias, and pure gritty survival. We've completely shifted from fearing a divine judge to fearing the very industrial and digital machines we built with our own hands.
And that brings us to this ultimate debate frame, which structures this tension perfectly. On side A, you had the case for stability. The argument here is that endings must be managed super carefully to ensure continuity. We have to protect the status quo to prevent utter chaos. But then on side B, you have the counter-argument for progress. This side says that endings actually expose the hard truth and force necessary progress. In this view, a crisis isn't just something to be avoided. It is literally the ultimate driver of human innovation. We need things to break so we can build them back better.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this core philosophy. The reality is, the world is almost never actually ending in some final, predictable way. But humans, we constantly behave as if it is. Endings in real life are gradual, they're uncertain, and they're massively amplified by our own psychology. And it is exactly that belief that shapes our politics, drives our deepest fears, influences our global decisions, and ultimately creates both our worst collapses and our greatest leaps of progress. So the provocative thought I want to leave you with today is this. Does our relentless, anxious obsession with preparing for the end ironically become the very engine that drives human civilization forward? Something to think about. Thanks for exploring this with me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.